By the way, before I wanted to talk, as I mentioned before we started recording, mainly about the defining paper of your career, the computational modeling paper. But before that, I just had a couple of kind of slightly random questions just about stuff I saw on your Google Scholar and your website. So I was just curious whether, because I guess R.C. Wilson isn't the least common abbreviation. So there's on your Google Scholar, there's one book from 1958.
Oh, really? That wasn't me.
Yeah. So I was about to say either you're in phenomenal shape for your age,
right,
or it was someone else.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of Robert Wilsons. There are 2 Nobel Prize winners called Robert Wilson.
So far,
exactly.
So, there was this one thing in 58. And then it actually started, a couple of years before you got your PhD.
Right.
But there was a couple of papers or proceedings or something like that on gate recognition.
Yes.
Which might have been you, but there was also some on sedimentary rocks.
Sedimentary rocks, yeah.
Was that also
NMR, you? That was me. That was
also you. Okay. So then my question is, number one, what's cool about gate recognition and sedimentary rocks? And number two, how do you go from there to your next thing? I think your next publication was on Hopfield networks.
Parallel Hopfield networks, yeah. I've been cited about 3
more
times.
Relevant.
Yeah, maybe that'll boost my citations on that paper.
But yeah, I was just curious. I know you as someone who does mainly for reinforcement learning stuff,
right?
That kind of area, let's say roughly. But how do we go from all of that we just mentioned to reinforcement learning?
Yeah, so I have this sort of strange path through computational neuroscience, or I don't even know what you call the field, computational cognitive neuroscience, right? I guess that's the name of the field that we're sort of settling on. In that I started out as a chemistry undergraduate. And so then as part of that, to my eternal shame, I did an internship in an oil company, Schlumberger, in Connecticut. And they've since moved up to Boston. But that internship, I was looking at rocks and doing NMR of rocks. So they are very interested in essentially using, MRI technology or, magnetic resonance technology to probe the structure of rocks down an oil well to sort of figure out how much oil is in there, how easy is it to get that oil out of there. If it weren't like destroying the planet, it's really, fascinating science. And so my summer project there was probing diffusion in rocks in very low field. So it was permanent magnet MRI. So not, the big MRI machines that you see. It was like this desktop thing that's, about a meter across. And we probed diffusion in different rocks and in a thing of glass beads as well. And then I can't even remember what we were doing to the 2-dimensional inverse Laplace transform. It was all about that, to try and find the structure of these rocks. And in particular, the role of oh God, what was it? It was like magnetic impurities, like changing how you interpret these things. So that was very early on when I was still in the chemistry world. And
by the way, what's kind of it's maybe not that surprising, but so I've always found chemistry to be the most boring topic in the world. And somehow I think you're like the 4th guest or something I know now about who's mentioned their chemistry undergraduate.
Oh,
somehow, it's by now becoming a pretty reoccurring thing of people doing chemistry and then not sticking with it, which I support.
Right,
but
that's funny.
I'm surprised that it happens so frequently. Yeah, but again, it's not that surprising,
right?
Given how interdisciplinary neuroscience is.
I think that's it. And especially back then, sort of 20 odd years ago, training for this stuff was just not established. Even really at the graduate level. There was Gatsby at UCL, right?
Again, come into lots of fame this week.
Yeah, exactly. But there wasn't much. There wasn't, you couldn't do a computational neuroscience PhD, really anywhere. Gatsby was probably the closest you could get. And certainly at the undergraduate level, there's really nothing, And so that's why you have all these folks that came in from physics or chemistry or math, or biology, right? The more traditional bio route or psychology route. But, a lot of the quantitative stuff just wasn't taught on that side. So, a lot of the modelers come from this sort of physics background. That's changing now. That education, undergraduate education is changing. we're hopefully at Georgia Tech getting a major on computation and cognition, which is going to be, entirely this stuff, right? Computational neuroscience, mathematical psychology, training people to do the job that I do, that my generation, we kind of just had to figure it out as we went along. What were the useful things to know? So, yeah, I guess that's where that weird paper comes from. The gate stuff was after I'd made the transition. So I was already doing a PhD in bioengineering at that point at Penn. This guy, Lee Finkel, who sadly has passed away since, he was making biophysical neural network models and models of single cells and trying to understand all sorts of things. But the project that we were working on as part of that was biological gait recognition, right? So this is kind of this, you show the classic example of this is you show the points from like a motion capture device. So you put points on the joints, and you look at those when they're not moving, and it just looks like a random collection of dots. But then the minute they start moving, you instantly recognize that as a person walking. You can even do things like say the age, gender, all sorts of things. There's also and even recognize individuals. If you know them from how they move.
Isn't that also how I don't know whether they still do it, but at least how they used to do a lot of the animation for films and that kind of stuff, right, that they got actual people to do it, and then they used that to...
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I remember one thing that we did as part of the PhD was to create a motion capture data set where I remember this is when I used to run a lot, and I'd been out for a really long run in the morning. And then I came into the lab and they put me on a treadmill in one of these funny motion capture suits and made me do more running and more walking for hours. I remember being completely exhausted at the end of it. So that was a fun project, kind of the way in to that stuff. So I was somewhat involved in some of that, not the main project for the PhD. And then I sort of transitioned over to these more neural network models and Bayesian models, still pure model. And then from there transitioned into the actual, sort of psychology, neuroscience side where I was doing experiments on people.
Yeah. So once you had your excursion into gait and rocks, it was basically, from then I think it was fairly contained to
exactly
what I might expect.
At that point, it's computational neuroscience and then really cognitive neuroscience since about 2009.
Yeah. And then the last kind of thing that I had there, which is interesting, and this I know you do because it's also on your website, is the phishing thing.
Yes.
So how does that thing fit into it, and where does that come from?
That's a good question. I guess the...
So talk about phishing.
My phishing is with PH. Yes, it's not I'm not an angler. No, this is studying email phishing, right? Where you get an email from the Nigerian prince or whoever it is, right? And you click on the link, and then you're in trouble. So that I guess comes from. What it came out of was one of these events held by the McKnight Brain Research Foundation, which I was part of when I was at the University of Arizona, and that is in a bunch of different areas, but the Brain Research Foundation is a set of 4 universities: University of Arizona, Florida, Miami, and Birmingham, Alabama. And they organized this event to get a bunch of researchers together talking. And, that basically connected me with this researcher, Natalie Ebner, who's at University of Florida studying phishing. And she just had this beautiful task where she actually phished people for real. So people sign up for an experiment under some cover story. And the real experiment is I send you a bunch of phishing emails and I check whether you click on the link or not. And I just thought that was such a beautiful measure. And so, obvious question from there was, can we do that in the lab, right? And when we do that in the lab, does it relate to the behavior in the real world, which, in some ways is kind of a holy grail for psychology, right? You would like to be able to measure something in the lab and have it tell you something about, is someone going to get phished in the real world? So that was a really interesting hook. And then, I guess more generally, my research is...
Nice metaphor.
Yes, exactly. My research is all about like computational modeling of behavior. And this is a behavior, right? And you can build a computational model of it, especially now that you have large language models, you can actually handle verbal report data. And you can ask the first thing we did with just the in-lab behavior was ask do we see order effects in that? So, there's classic order effects in all sorts of psychology tasks where the last trial influences this trial. And a classic effect on these kinds of judgment tasks is you see a sort of repetition of the last response and a negative effect of the last stimulus. And you get that if you're essentially comparing the last stimulus to the new stimulus and you're using your last response as an anchor. And, we see exactly those order effects in that task. So that was kind of cool to see from that perspective. But yeah, now we're sort of throwing LLMs at this. You can start to ask, can I predict behavior? Can I predict who's going to fall for a particular email? Is this person going to fall for that email? So that's really interesting. And then you can also ask things by doing sort of dimensionality reduction, kind of like factor analysis, basically. You can ask, what's the dimensionality of phishing susceptibility, right? Is it a high dimensional, individual differences determined by a high dimensional vector, right? Or is it relatively low dimensional? There are just people who fall for it and people who don't, right? And, we, in our unpublished stuff so far, we're seeing it's about 5 dimensions for the behavior on this task, right? And that's one issue, is we only have, about an hour's worth of data from one person, which is about 200 emails, which is, limited in its scope to a certain extent. But it's just an interesting behavior and something where maybe, I felt like I could add something both in terms of the experiment, but also in terms of the analysis.
Okay. Yeah. So it was a bit of a random origin in that sense, that it wasn't, something you thought made complete sense from what you did before, but it was kind of this, the word, like serendipitous meeting.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, it was sort of serendipitous. I think it was also, but also, I think once you have this skill set to make computational models of behavior, you can apply it to a lot of different situations. It's not just the situations in the 10 Simple Rules paper, right? Like binary choice and reinforcement learning. You could build a computational model of navigation, right? We've done that recently, head turning, right? You can build a computational model of perceptual decision-making. You can build now computational model of how people process verbal data, right? Like that becomes, it's the same set of skills. So I think it fits in that respect. And it also fits in this sense of what are the real world applications, right, of what you're doing and what's the real world behavior. And this is a case where we could actually answer that question. And we, Natalie just published this paper where you combine both tasks. And there is a correlation between the in-lab task and the real-world task at the individual difference level, but it's like 0.2. It's a big effect by psychology standards, but a relatively small effect, which is interesting, right, in its own right. I mean, that there's a case where obviously when you're getting phished in real life, it's a very different situation to sitting in the lab. But we tried to make the lab task as similar similar as we could, right? They're reading emails, they're deciding whether they're phishing or not. They're doing all of these things that in principle should tap into a lot of the same cognitive processes, and the best you can do is, a correlation of 0.2 between their in-lab behavior and their real-world behavior. So that's a really interesting finding in its own right? That goes beyond, sort of speaks to this general issue, right? That, I think a bunch of people have said this. Russ Baldrak is one of them, right? That these in-lab tasks that we have maybe don't capture the same, for whatever reason, don't capture the cognitive processes that we thought, or at least don't capture individual differences in the way that we thought they should. Yeah.
Yeah, when we say that's a huge problem, to me that's it's almost like one of the main pillar problems of experimental psychology, right? Like, how do you? For me, like for the stuff I do, which is often, for now, it's fairly simple, like gamble decision making kind of things.
Yeah.
I think it might be a similar thing. It's just usually people make one of those decisions and then they wait 3 hours, and then they make another one, then they wait 2 days, and then, rather than 200 in a row.
Yeah.
And my behavior, I took part in these as a participant first back in my master's in one of these studies. And it's interesting. So actually, I think this was one of Rob Rutledge's study.
Yeah.
When he was still at UCL. And later on, then I think they had at UCL like a PhD program, and I wrote him an email about interest in PhD kind of things, and we talked a little bit about this I was kind of then randomly interested in the thing that I think I took part in. Mm-hmm. And so I basically said I didn't like this setup of doing 200 decisions in a row because then that takes chance out of it. And so before I knew about the whole economics literature and all this, that just like stubbornly calculated the expected value of the options. And I actually asked the experimenters whether they could just calculate that for me, because that's all I'm doing. And now this becomes a test of like my ability to do calculations in my head.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And apparently, yes, I had to finish it to get paid.
Right.
And no, that is not normal behavior.
Right.
Because apparently no one does it. That's what then Rob said later on. Most people don't do that.
Right. But that's so interesting, right? And if you'd not told him that, you are a subject that looks like expected value decision making. If you did model selection on that behavior, you would hopefully find that you're a pure expected value decision maker, right? And
which I was in that task,
which you were, right?
But not necessarily in real life,
right? Exactly. What does that mean? For your real life behavior, right? And what has been missed? And so much about a task is you're not doing the behavior that you're doing in the real world. You're doing a psychology experiment in a lab, right? And there's expectations on what you think is expected of you, and there's all these sort of strange processes that come in, and I think people have tried to study them, but it's very, makes interpreting these things hard.
I mean, I think actually the best example of this is actually, not joking. So I'm now at the University of Zurich and the part of the economics department, even though we're doing neuroeconomics. But I'm not joking. Day one, I received an email from the head of department.
Oh, wow.
Asking for a meeting. And I thought, that's interesting. That was quick.
Right.
And then I told the person sitting next to me in the office, I was like, is that normal? And she's like, oh, no, there's like standard like spam emails that we get pretending to be the head of department.
Right. Yes.
So again, if I was an experiment where I was supposed to detect phishing, I would behave very differently. In that moment, I was thinking, I just arrived at the department.
Yeah.
I mean, it's surprising that he would mail me.
Yeah.
But it wasn't completely out of I just had a completely different mindset, and it wasn't completely unreasonable that he would.
Yeah.
I don't know maybe it's just very personable.
No, that's right. I got semi-phished by an email like that from my department head, and they'd done a great job. They'd gotten her picture off the internet, and they sort of spoofed her email address. And it was like a one-word email. It was like available ? And or available to talk or something. And the thing is, she sends emails like that. That's and I was like, I'll be right down. So I went to her office, and apparently I was one of many that had been there that day.
Just a congregation in front of our office.
Yeah, exactly. And clearly they're sophisticated, right? And there's an interesting question of you go down the rabbit hole with them, right? You may be suspicious at first, but not suspicious enough to not respond, right? And then, once you started engaging, you end up going, getting locked into a response, and you can't do the reversal, right? And I think that is something that was not captured in our task of just, can you detect these things or not?
To me, what's also surprising is just that from what I understand, and I don't know whether this is just like common myth or something, but from what I understand with most phishing emails, you try and filter out the skeptical people by having like obviously fake emails,
right?
Kind of thing. So like only to not be mean, but like only the idiots would kind of click through these things and think they're real, right? Because you have like spelling errors everywhere. I've heard that's intentional, just so the people who might be skeptical don't pick up on, you basically filter out the people. Exactly. So when I actually get a phishing email that's like perfect, it just, I'm approaching it from a completely different angle. Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and obviously a big thing that's changed phishing emails is ChatGPT, right? Like now you can, there's no excuse for them except if they're trying to weed out, the sort of smart people, right, there's no excuse for them to have spelling mistakes anymore, right, or bad English, right? They can just put it into ChatGPT and get a perfectly worded email. So that's completely, and that was a lot of, what people are picking up on is spelling mistakes, is bad grammar, is a weird request, right? Those are the things that people pick up on as being indicative of phishing, and a lot of those things they can get rid of now. Yeah, it is interesting. And it's amazing how many smart people and how many people in general just fall for these things. There was a community group in Tucson where we were, like the neighborhood association, they lost $5,000, by someone just being, pretending to be the president and emailing the treasurer saying, I need you to send this check to these people. And, it's a voluntary organization, right? People are busy and, this is a sort of standard interaction for that. It's not a huge amount of money. And there you go, $5,000 is gone, right? Like it's, and it happens a lot. And there's a lot of shame associated with it as well. And that makes it worse, right? People are ashamed they've lost, thousands of dollars, and then they don't tell people, and then they can get sucked in. I mean, it's, there's a huge human cost to it, not just money, but mental health issues, and there are a lot of people who are getting sucked into these things. And, and obviously, so Natalie is an aging researcher, and aging, Alzheimer's disease, cognitive impairment, it really is, these folks are despicable, right? Like they're cheating people out of their money, very vulnerable people. Usually the people who are falling for it are vulnerable people. And so it's, so that aspect of it as well, just, in terms of like why phishing is, that it is interesting to think about something that might have a practical application, right? So the hope was, and maybe there's still a hope, but the hope is you could develop some kind of test that you could give to someone that's, as part of a standard cognitive battery that's like, it might be time for you to, not have such easy access to your bank account, right? That you can just ship off money to random people on the internet. Or there needs to be a second check, or they need, something like that. So I do think that it's kind of exciting to have something that has such a clear practical component to it.
Yeah, I guess one of the common, should put it, I guess, at least at the PhD level, probably also about beyond that, there's the sense of occasionally you get, what am I doing here?
Right.
I'm creating this like silly task, and
right.
And then you go, maybe I should do something applied.
Right.
That's the solution to my existential angst.
Right.
So I guess you've leaned into that.
But
it's nice.
Yeah,
right?
it's nice. It's nice, but also I think I think the applications are important, but also I think the applications can drive interesting questions as well. You start to ask questions that maybe you wouldn't normally ask. I mean, certainly dealing with verbal data, you asked me 5 years ago or 10 years ago if I'd be, trying to model verbal data, I'd be like, no way in a million years. And now, partly because of this phishing stuff, partly because of the AI, it's you ask interesting questions. And I do think there's an importance to that. I think there's a huge importance to the basic science as well. And I think really the exciting part is where, take the applied stuff as inspiration. But I do think there is something to be said for thinking about what the actual application of this stuff is. And also real world problems. I do think real world cognition, and there are a lot of folks, on this now, right? People are trying to measure all sorts of, cognitive processes in the real world. I do think that's a huge area and hugely important. And I think inspirational as well to the lab. I think, a couple of years ago, there was this work on foraging, not a couple of years ago, but, it's ongoing. But folks like Ben Hayden, Michael Platt, Dave Reddish, right, started doing work on foraging and, inspired by real world foraging, right, of animals. And that's a very sort of relevant behavior and realistic behavior. And also from a modeling perspective, super cool, right? The whole marginal value theorem type stuff of patch foraging. So this is beautiful research. But what they did was they used it to inspire lab tasks that the animals in the lab would learn a lot faster. I mean, sort of anecdotally, I think they learn these tasks a lot faster than they do these sort of arbitrary tasks that we force animals to do. And then you end up with some of these beautiful things, like that restaurant row task from Dave Reddish's lab is just absolutely beautiful. And, it's got a theoretical component to it as well, but also just this really, ecologically valid behavior. And so I do think there is, that would be an example of this, where you have this, realistic behavior. I mean, maybe it's not really applied research, right? But it's like this realistic behavior driving development of in-lab tasks that are maybe getting getting at a different kind of behavior that you can get a computational handle on. So I thought that was, I do think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I guess there's two sides to it, right? In some sense, I feel like going the complete abstract way and just doing stuff that are increasingly separated from reality, like from a physical reality, can actually be interesting because then you end up in places you never would. But I think often it's good to be anchored to, actual behavior. And so you don't go, isn't it like the case with like lots of these like logical, problems for humans that are often only not solved correctly when you give them in weird examples.
Yeah.
But if you give them in different examples, most people solve them correctly.
Right.
Know, so it's like sometimes losing connection to what people actually do usually can just lead you completely astray.
Right, that's right. But there, equally there is, you're right. I mean, there is a place for this sort of abstract basic thinking and computational thinking. I mean, I made my career around computational models and abstract computational models of these things. So, there's definitely a place for that as well.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start talking about, the paper about computational modeling. I guess we've already been talking about some parts of modeling for the last couple of minutes. Yeah, I mean, as I said before we started recording, I feel like your 10 simple steps paper in eLife is a paper that most people I know have read. And I'm starting to learn computational modeling. It's also one of the first things I read, just to get a kind of nice overview of kind of roughly how the whole thing works. And yeah, maybe as an introduction, why write the paper? There's so many textbooks about this. There's lots of stuff about this already out there. Right. And I feel like occasionally I've had some other interviews where people did these kind of tutorial-esque papers, and they have said that they've faced they've had some difficulty getting it published because people, would say, well, do we really need this? We already know how this works. And then they were often, like yours, very well-appreciated papers. So I'm actually just curious, like, why write this paper? And did you face anything like that, or was it?
So the publication barriers are real, and definitely want to thank eLife for publishing that. Yeah, I won't say which journals, but we went to two journals, one of which gave a full peer review that was positive, and still rejected it. It was a DES reject after peer review at one journal, which was bizarre. But we'd put it online as a preprint. We already knew it was going to be really popular just from the number of downloads. And it was great that eLife sort of open-minded enough in their publication model that they were willing to take it. I mean, I guess why write a paper like this? There's sort of two reasons. One, more practical, was I'm often working with students who are new to computational modeling, and I just wanted to be able to give them something that's, okay, read this, so that I don't have to answer, the first 90% of questions. So that was one component. But the other has a sort of older sort of motivation. And it's as I came up in science in the 2010s, really, sort of in my postdoc, it was sort of like the heyday, the early 2010s and, sort of late 2000s was the heyday of this kind of stuff, or when this stuff was really exciting and new and you could get these high impact papers, publishing these model-based analyses. And, there are all sorts of claims that you can do things with the model that you can't do with just simple measures. And I just remember being kind of, when I got to doing it myself, being kind of skeptical of the claims that are being made and how rigorous the process is. So you fit these models, and I just remember it almost feels like magic when you do it, right? You write down a likelihood function and then you throw it into some minimizer or whatever, right? And you get some parameter values, and then you can simulate the behavior, which people at that time didn't do so much. They just throw it into the just report the parameter values, right? And which model was the best fitting. And it does feel very black boxy in that respect. I mean, obviously it's not a black box, right? But it feels very black boxy. And I just remember thinking when I was doing it, is this real? And so the first thing you do then is start simulating it. And you say, well, if I know the ground truth, do I get the ground truth back? And a lot of times you don't. If your experiment isn't good enough, or if you have bugs in your code, right? That's another reason. But certainly if you have an experiment that's not got enough trials or not got the right kinds of trials, you can't get your parameters back, or you can't tell the difference between two models. And so I guess it kind of came out of a frustration there. And there's one lab meeting I remember at Princeton where we had this big old debate because there was people were fitting different models to a task that was sort of like a grid world task. And, where you're moving around in a grid space, like a really, terrible video game, right? And, they fit all these different models. And the model that won was like a pure choice kernel model, which says what you do is you just repeat what you did last time. And, I just remember thinking, well, maybe it won on like BIC or whatever, whatever sort of model comparison measure you used. But this model can't actually do the task. This model just if you were to simulate this model, it produces nonsensical behavior because it just repeats what it did on the last trial, the last movement. And I do remember it was a big debate, right, in the lab meeting as to, well, maybe we should do this model because it fits best. But I'm like, clearly not. It can't do the task, right? And just a simple simulation would rule it out. That's when I realized like this really like needs to be, someone needs to sort of say something about this kind of thing. And that was sort of the deeper drive for this, was like trying to sort of boost the quality. And then, the 10 simple rules format, originally it was just going to be a short comment. There are these 10 simple rules papers in PLOS biology. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, I was thinking of it being that kind of format, of relatively short paper, and then it just kind of took on a life of its own, and it sort of sat on the back burner for a little bit, and then I went to visit Berkeley and chatted with Anne, and we were like, let's just finish writing this paper, and it just became this big thing, and since I think this will be the thing that people remember me for, is this paper.
Yeah, it's funny, those modeling things where a model wins but doesn't actually do the task. This is like a less sophisticated level than what you were describing, but I recently just fiddled around a little bit with evolutionary simulations and trying to, get something simple going there and see how it works. And I ended up with something quite interesting that kind of supported my hypotheses. And then in the end, I realized like, oh no, wait, I just have a model that doesn't do anything. Right. And because I don't have an inbuilt cost for each decision, the ones that wins just don't do anything. And it wins the competition in this sense, but only because the competition isn't realistic in that sense.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll be kind of going over most of the steps, or some of them. We'll see how far we get. I thought maybe to start off with, this is also what you I say, if it was my great idea, it's the beginning of your paper, which is kind of like a step 0, which is a little bit of like, why do this kind of computational modeling? What do we gain from it? I mean, I've had some episodes about this with Paul Smordino in particular, about the use of formal models. But just in the context of this, I come from a psychology background, so my thinking is very much in, you have some sort of vague hypothesis, and then you create categories and compare them to each other, and then something significant or not, and that's it. Why do I need this whole modeling thing? It sounds very complicated. What are the main advantages of doing computational modeling, and what does it give us that we can't do without it?
Yeah, I think the big thing with anything computational mathematical is it forces you to be very explicit about what you mean when you're describing a cognitive process. And if you want that simulation to run on a computer, you can't fudge anything, right? You have to specify your parameters. You have to specify what you think is going to happen under these conditions. And that, in and of itself, without any of the other benefits, just makes you be very explicit about what, forces you to think at a much deeper level about your theory. You can't hand wave anything away. So that's really cool. I think it's also important from a communication perspective as well. It's unambiguous, right? You've written down your model, you've written down some equations, you've made it clear how that model is going to apply in different situations. And if somebody else wants to go and run that model, hopefully you've shared the code so they can. But if you've shared the equations, it should be the exact same model that someone can implement years in the future. And this is fun to do. It's the Nobel Prize, in the last couple of weeks, right? And if you go back and look at Hopfield's paper, look at those equations, and you can simulate that model. I did it actually in my class the other day. After, the day after they announced it, we just dropped everything. We're like, let's talk about Hopfield networks, and it behaves exactly as he said it does, and you can simulate that, and that's very explicit about what you mean. It's very explicit about what, in his case, what a memory is, right, and what it means to recall a memory, in that model. There's a a power that allows people to build on what you've done, right? And I think that is a big part of the reason for modeling. I think there are other things, sort of these downstream things like parameter estimation, right? Picking apart cognitive processes. That's a lot, sort of the nitty gritty of this paper, right? And characterizing individual differences. I think all of these things are really, really good. Yeah, and really useful. But I think the bigger picture is, once you've written something down and a bunch of equations, it's unambiguous as to what you're doing.
Yeah, especially when I talk about, so parameter recovery for me is an interesting one that I think is, we'll talk about that later, but I think that's a really interesting one that just gives you precision about your experiment that you would otherwise not get, or would be difficult to get. Just briefly, before we, get into the details of modeling, I was just curious kind of when, in a sense, should one start thinking about this? I mean, is this the kind of thing one should start doing right from the beginning of an experiment, not like in your career or whatever? I mean, like in a project, or does it require a kind of prior expertise and precision in knowing what you're actually doing before you can actually nail it down, to first get like a vague sense of the shape of what you're doing and then nail it down? Or would you actually start with a model from the beginning? That's
a big question. And I think a lot depends on your experience level. I think for me, when someone who's, done a PhD in this, right, or, has got an experience with modeling, I think you're sort of always thinking about it from that perspective. And how can I cast this, what do I mean with this psychological question? And how could I make a task? How could I make a task to get it? And then how would I model that? And then the model is a part of that. And oftentimes, especially when you're coming at things from a computational perspective, the question is driven by the computation, right? So, you want to study the explore-exploit dilemma, and from theoretical work that you can do that in at least two ways. You can seek information explicitly, or you could just randomize your choice. And that's something that I think you don't even have those concepts if you are not thinking about it in a modeling way. And then from there, the experiment flows. I think a more traditional approach, especially for folks that are less experienced, but also if you're new to an area, I think it's much more, you start somewhere, you make some kind of experiment. You want to make, if you take this approach, you want to make sure that you can analyze your experiment in a traditional way and it's going to tell you something. Because oftentimes when you just throw a model at it, it's not going to tell you much more, because you didn't design the task in a way that allows you to get at the parameters that you want, right? So, I mean, a classic example of this would be the Iowa gambling task, right? You want to study decision-making, and so you come up with this Iowa gambling task, and it's a very engaging task. People will play it.
So just very briefly, what is it again?
Oh, sorry, the Iowa gambling.
Just like a 30-second overview,
So you choose between 4 card decks, and each card deck pays out probabilistic rewards. There's the 4 card decks are set up such that the first 2, A and B, are on average bad, but they pay out higher rewards in the short term. And then C and D are on average good, but they tend to pay out smaller rewards, right? But their punishments are less. So, that's a task to study decision making. It's hugely important in the field, in the neuropsychology of decision making. It detected deficits in patients where, like OFC lesion patients, where you couldn't otherwise see decision making or couldn't see cognitive deficits. So it's a hugely important task. But if you try to model that task, it's just a mess, and there have been heroic efforts to model it, but it's really limited in what you can say because of the design of the task. If you look at the distribution of rewards, the gains are either plus 50 or plus 100. The losses can be anywhere down to minus 1,000. So very unequal distribution of gains and losses. You get a gain on every trial, but losses are probabilistic. There's an exploitation component. There's a risk-taking component. There's all these other, there's all sorts of weird things going on in that task. But the reason it was successful is there is a very simple way you can analyze it, which is just how often do you choose the good decks as a function of time, that allows you to detect deficits in certain populations that makes sense, right? And so I think that's a really great example of a task where, and a field, I mean, it sort of predates the sort of computational modeling of behavior, at least the sort of modern model fitting of behavior. But it's sort of like you develop a task that's a great assay of decision-making or gets at some aspects of decision-making, then you think about it and try to model it and realize actually it's terrible for modeling decision-making. You can't get parameters very well. You have to make all sorts of assumptions to do it. And that's not to say there haven't been incredible efforts to try and do that, but you're ultimately limited by the task. And so if you want to go to the next step, you start making different kinds of tasks, like a task just for explore exploit, or a task just for risk, or a task just for ambiguity, or a task to measure gains and losses, right? In a way that you can actually back out a loss aversion parameter. And it's actually, when you do parameter recovery, you can get it reliably out of there. So I think that is, that trajectory of that field sort of maps the trajectory of how most people end up sort of approaching computational modeling. Is you have some task that's based on good psychological intuition for what might be wrong or how people might be that should give you interesting results in the simple statistics. And then you apply a model to it and you realize, oh, if I really wanted to apply this model, I should have designed a better experiment. And then you go back and design the better experiment. And that may be, that could be 2 or 3 papers by the time you're down there. That's a PhD, right? But I think that is the wise approach to doing it. And I think especially that second stage, it's important to be kind of realistic in what you can expect the model to do. And this was a hard lesson for me. And I think for everyone in the field, there's sort of this realization that if you can't see something in the raw data, you usually can't see it. The model's not going to let you see it either. The model can get you more precision, but you can't do. I remember in my PhD, we did this thing with, very briefly had this voltage sensitive dye data set that people were sharing with us. We were applying all these crazy image processing tools to try and extract interesting information out of it. And the only thing we could get was on one trial where you could see very clearly a propagating wave in the raw data. Could we get anything interesting, any of our sophisticated tools to actually pick anything up? On the other trials where you couldn't see anything with your eye, it was basically noise. You couldn't see anything with a model either. And I think that is a real lesson. I mean, there's some times where you can get things out that you can't see in the raw data. I'm of a firm opinion that the window between things that you can see with simple analyses and things that you can see with a model is not as big as people would like to believe.
So, I mean, if I understand it correctly, then I guess for one, you need the simple analysis also to kind of check that, some basic sanity checks of what you're doing actually makes sense.
Yeah.
And that that the model roughly agrees with that. But it seems to me then that if I understand it correctly, that kind of the model is always a consideration on top of an existing experiment.
Yeah.
Something that can, you have something, and it's not like the model completely replaces it. The model analysis completely replaces everything else, but it's something that adds something that the original couldn't do itself.
Exactly. So, yeah, exactly. When you're fitting a model to an experiment, it's getting more information out or more precise information than you could say with just a more qualitative analysis of the data, sort of means and standard deviations. I think where the model really comes into its own, though, is when you take that next step and you design the experiment with the model in mind, because then you're asking a question that you may not have even conceived before. An example of that, we did some stuff on exploration, exploitation, and, being random in your exploration. That's the sort of standard epsilon greedy, softmax type exploration that people have talked about in the RL world, in the, computational side of that world. But there's an interesting question. Is that actually random? Is that choice behavior, behavioral variability that you see, is it actually random? And we have a task that seems to suggest that under conditions where people should explore, they become more random. But then you can think about this mechanistically in terms of a model and in terms of a drift diffusion model, right? Where randomness in a choice in the drift diffusion model can actually be modulated in 2 ways. It could be modulated by you just adding more noise to the whole process, right? Or changing the signal to noise ratio. Or you could be more random in your choice, in your button presses, by reducing the threshold in this model, right? So the drift diffusion model, you accumulate noisy evidence to a bound. If that bound is really low, then you're more likely to make a wrong decision because you went to the wrong bound. that's two different mechanisms by which you could get random exploration, right? And that's, you wouldn't even, without thinking about the DDM first, you wouldn't even have posed that question. And then you can ask in the experiment that you design, you can ask, well, what does that mean for the experiment? Well, those two things mean something quite different. If you're reducing your signal to noise ratio, it means in conditions where you're more random, you should be slower. If you reduce your threshold in conditions where you're more random, you should be faster, right? So you don't even need the model fit at that point to test that hypothesis. It's just, do they speed up or slow down in situations where they're more random? And in fact, they slow down. So it's a signal to noise story. The model, then you add the model and say, okay, let's estimate the parameters and see, does the threshold change? Does the signal to noise ratio change? And it's mostly the signal to noise ratio. There's a little bit of threshold. And then you could go on further and you can simulate and say, well, how much of the behavioral noise variability change, the choice variability change, is driven by the threshold and how much is driven by the signal to noise ratio? And you could see it's about 80% is on the signal to noise ratio. So that was a case where you wouldn't have even thought to do that analysis, or at least to understand what that reaction time analysis is telling you without putting it in the context of a drift diffusion model. So that, I think, is a case where, it sort of illustrates the power of these models, and thinking about these models, it drives you to experiments and analyses and simple analyses that you wouldn't have without having that context of the model.
I guess we've already, hit on a couple of points that we'll probably refer to later, but to kind of maybe go a little bit through the steps. I mean, so we've talked, and I guess, in a lot about the importance of the experiment, that kind of thing. Yeah. But, again, before we started recording, that was the point you wanted to hit on a bit more.
Yep.
Because I guess most people it's a paper modeling, so like, why do I have to care about the experiment? I wanted to see about the modeling stuff.
Yep.
But we already mentioned some parts of it, maybe to be a bit more explicit in this context. Why is step 1 and 2 still design an experiment and build models? Why is that, or especially the first design experiment? Why is that still the most important step?
Yeah, I really think it is the most important because, so much, especially in my early career as a modeler, someone comes to you with an experiment saying, can you model this? And it can even be yourself. I have this experiment, I want to model it. And that's where you really run into the limits of what you can say about these things. You very quickly realize that the experiment can't tell you much about this model, or this model applied to this experiment doesn't really tell you much. And so I think that really is such a key component if you're going to be building computational models of behavior, is that you build them on an experiment that can actually tell you something. And this is true in any experiment, right? If you don't measure the thing that you're trying to measure, or, you're not designing an experiment that can answer the question you're trying to ask, then you're never going to get anywhere. But I guess people get these blinkers on when you have a model. They think it's like this magical thing that you can apply and understanding comes out the other end. And it doesn't, right? It is garbage in, garbage out. If you put in experimental data from an experiment that can't tell you anything, then no model is going to save that, right? I mean, models can do cool things, and maybe even in an experiment where, seemingly nothing's going on, maybe there is interesting things you could model. Maybe it's order effects you could model or whatever, right? Maybe not the actual question you wanted to answer. But I do think experimental design is just so critical a component of it. I think it's not what people read this paper for. And certainly when you first encounter this paper, I think folks are reading it to learn how to do reinforcement learning models, right? And I think that's fine and good, and a good use of the paper. But I think the next step, if you're serious about a modeling, career and having that as part of your research, is to then say, okay, I've modeled this one experiment that wasn't really optimized for the model. Now let's actually think about what the correct experiment should be and think more carefully. So maybe it's point 1, but maybe the way people actually encounter is it's point 11, right? When they come back to do it the second time, right? When you actually have a model in mind, now you can ask the question that actually tests the key assumptions of the model.
Yeah, I mean, how do you, and of course, as you mentioned, this is an iterative process. Mm-hmm. It's not like you go through step 1 to 10, then you're finished.
Yeah.
This is, in your paper, you have a couple of loops of where you might go back. And of course, this is also just schematic. In reality, it's probably a little bit messier than that.
Yep.
But maybe it seems to me like it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation where how do I know what a good experiment is without having tried whether the model works on it, in a sense? I mean, like, how do I know what's a good experiment for my model?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a hard question, right? It's an art as much as it is a science, right? And, I think the practical approach to it is try to build a model of the experiment that you have, and you'll start to see what the issues are with it, right? So you start to build something, say, of the Iowa gambling task, for example, and you see that, oh, hang on, there are outliers in the loss domain, but there aren't outliers in the gain domain. And maybe I want to understand, like, how do people process outliers in the gain domain as well? And maybe when I'm simulating this, I have to understand the explore-exploit trade-off as well, because there's an exploration component, especially early in this task. Okay, well, I can model that in different ways, but maybe I want to focus just on the explore-exploit component, or maybe I don't. Maybe I care about ambiguity, or I care about risk, or so I think it really is. It's as different as the scientific question is different, right? Like, what do you want to say from your experiment? But I do think trying it is a key component to it. And then trying to boil it down to its essence. I think that's a key component, especially if you're doing lab tasks. I think really trying to boil things down to their essence is important. So in exploration, exploitation, a big thing we did was just try to find the simplest possible way you could get an explore-exploit dilemma, and the simplest possible way you could change the relative value of exploration. And what we sort of settled on was this horizon manipulation. If you have a long time horizon, it makes sense to explore early on. If you have a short time horizon, it doesn't make sense to explore. And so then the whole task flows from that, right? It's called the horizon task. Another example in this work we've been doing on head direction, path integration in head direction system, is how does your path integration system, navigated in the dark, how does that combine with visual input to, determine your location, or in this case, your heading? And so we had a very simple VR task where people turn in the dark and we give them a flash of visual information. And now we can ask, and we can, because it's in VR, you can offset the visual information relative to where they actually are. And now you've got a prediction error, right? And it's a visual prediction error. And that, it almost maps perfectly onto a kind of Rescola-Wagner type model in angle space now, right? We're interested in how do those things get combined? Is it in a Bayesian way? Is it in a Bayesian way, but sampling as opposed to averaging? And those are questions that you can start to address when you have an experiment that's like this, that's very simple. So there isn't really a sort of easy recipe for it. It really is, think deeply about the task that you have, think deeply about the models of the task that you have, but also think deeply about the question that you actually want to answer. And is there an alignment between the task that you have, the model that you have, and the question that you want to answer? And if not, right, something's got to change there. It could be the question. Maybe you're interested in a different question, right? Maybe you're interested in one group versus another, right? And in general decision making, not in, in which case the Iowa gambling task is great. If you just care, does this group have a decision making deficit relative to this other group? That's fine, right? But if you want something more fine grained, you're going to need to have a task where you can ask those fine grained questions. So yeah, it is unfortunately a circular, but as you do it, right, and it's certainly if you're doing this as a PhD student or as a postdoc, right, you have a few years, you go through, one task and you try it, you go through another task and you try it, and the second time around, you already have learned so much from the first time that you start to get an intuition. You do start to get an intuition for what's a good experiment and what kinds of things can I easily model versus what kinds of things am I not going to be so, not going to be so easy to model.
Yeah. I mean, I have to admit, it's a little bit disappointing that it's not easy, given that your paper is called 10 Simple Rules.
I know.
So, it does kind of suggest that this is going to be easy.
Yes. I mean, I think it's important to keep it. It's a simple rule to keep in mind. But But yes, it's not a simple rule to execute, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A rule can be easy to state, but hard to follow.
Yeah, it's, write a beautiful symphony, or a beautiful piece of music. It's easy to have that as a goal, and you would know it when you see it as well, or hear it, right? But to actually create it is hard, right? And yeah.
Yeah, so this is kind of the thing that I think is important, if I understood you correctly, and that I also kind of would like to be important because it's the kind of thing I also like doing, which is kind of what's the role of like intuition and introspection about the task? Because I'm assuming now this is now, I guess maybe also for animal research, but this question has come mainly from human research, where you actually do the task yourself and think about like, how would I do this task, right? Or like, how might people do this task, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how does that play into the whole thing?
I think that is a big role to sort of imagine, to do the task yourself and think about it. I mean, in some ways, a source of a model is your own introspection of how might this task be done. And obviously introspection is biased and incomplete, right? And you don't have access to all the computations that are going on. But certainly doing the task, getting a feel for the task is an important thing. And that can help with, even just surface level features. Like if you have lots of delays in a task, it can get really frustrating and slow and disengaging. Just doing having a task that's engaging is, I think, pretty important actually, right? A lot of these tasks, when you have to have lots of trials, just by definition, they become unengaging. But at least trying to make it, minimize the boredom level is an important part. So I think there is a role for doing the task yourself, for thinking about it, but also being aware that you are in a very weird position as an experimenter doing this, right? You're, obviously a highly educated person for a start, right? So you may think, and if you're a modeler, you're probably fairly at ease with mathematics, right? Certainly more than the general population. So you do have to be aware that people will solve your task in completely different ways than you could imagine. And I do think that is something to be aware of, right? That you live in a bubble, and the way you might think about a task is just completely different to how 90% of the population thinks about a task.
Yeah, that's one of my problems with, I have to do it, but with learning probability theory in a bit more detail, is that people doing your task are not going to know probability theory. So by default, if you learn it, you're going to think about the task differently than pretty much anyone you want to study.
Yes.
And it feels to me like it's almost like any study that deals with uncertainty should have one person who has no clue probability theory, collaborate with someone who actually knows how to model it. Because, most people, don't think about all the intricacies and the ways of how you might even consider probability.
Yes.
It's just sometimes stuff happens or whatever.
People, it is weird, right? People are really bad at probability, especially when it's explicitly described. But then people can be almost Bayesian if it's an experienced, something they're experienced with, right? Their intuitive reasoning can be really good, but if you put numbers on it, people are notoriously bad with probabilistic reasoning. It's all these Monty Hall problem, right? Things like that, right? That, that's a case where people, even with statistical training, get confused, right? So that's probably the best example I think I've heard of a case where, as a researcher, you were just unqualified as a sort of general member of the public to understand the decision process. It's even bigger for animals, right? Like, animals obviously experience the world in a completely different way to humans, right? And experience the lab in a completely different way to humans. I've certainly heard anecdotes of animal researchers trying to think like a rat, right? What is the rat actually doing? Yeah. So that.
But I think that's the nice. I think you're obviously right, but I think one thing that's kind of nice about animal research is that it's a different species, so it's more salient. That they have a different way of thinking about it. Whereas with humans, I think, especially when people think that there are normative ways about thinking about these things, you get frustrated with why they aren't doing it that way.
Right.
Even though the participants are always correct, basically.
Right.
It's...
it's really hard to imagine that people think differently about it, right? You see this in election politics, right? How can someone vote for this person or that person, right?
Yeah.
But even in the dress, right? That famous optical illusion, right? Like
Right.
blue or black or white and gold. And you just can't, in your bones, you feel like, how can anyone see it any other way? Yeah, and that is a bias that you can take into a behavioral experiment very much so when you're designing it.
Yeah. So, one thing I think is super important, which I guess comes out of this then also is pilot your data a lot and ask participants what they were doing.
Yes. Verbal report. So we've got a whole line of research now on explicit verbal report, thinking aloud, and then after the fact, reporting what people have been doing. And in fact, we're trying to model that, right, with all these LLMs. But that is I think it's just so huge. I remember, one of the things that drove us to do this was, again, one of these explore exploit tasks where we've found this really surprising result in older adults where there's a population of about 20% that will never choose an uncertain option, even if it is clearly the better option, right? You've seen one reward from it and it was 50, and you've seen 3 rewards from another one that were, mean 30. They never choose that 50 option. And what's interesting, there was this anecdotal report, the grad student was sort of sitting in there with the subject doing the task. And she was like, I want to choose this one, but I'm just not sure, and she went back to the other one. And at that point, we were like, we've got to do think aloud in this experiment. And we have a data set now. We've not looked at the data yet, but I would love to know, what do these folks who 20% of the time never, 20% of the people that never choose the uncertain option, what do they say? Do they say things that are qualitatively different than the other folks? Because, and again, it's my own bias. I look at that decision. I'm like, why on earth would you not choose that one? It doesn't make any sense to me. But clearly they're doing it, and they're doing it, 160 times. Well, maybe not 160 times, but 80 times in the experiment, which, clearly there's a very strong drive not to choose that option.
Yeah, there's lots of stuff we could. Whilst you were speaking, I had lots of other examples of silly stuff participants told me about just them doing the task intentionally the way you didn't want them to do it, even though you told them to do it a different way.
Right.
There's all sorts of other issues, but yeah, trying to stick a little bit to the actual modeling and not just idiosyncrasies of humans. I guess they have to be taken into account, but you can't model everything.
Right.
Like that one guy who found Jesus and cooperated on every single trial.
Oh, wow.
And got really badly exploited by one person. It
no.
was impressive to see in the data, just completely rinsed him.
Oh, no.
You almost have to have respect for just so consistently taking advantage of someone being nice.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, that's a different story. I guess we've kind of gone a little bit over steps 1 and 2, roughly. This is all... this is also, representative in some sense of, as we said, the actual modeling process, from what I understand. These aren't clearly separated steps.
Yeah.
Maybe 3, simulate, model, and experiment is, it seems fairly straightforward, I guess.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, I think, again, all of this paper is sort of like trying to raise the standard, right? And if you have a model, you can simulate that model, right? And I think that, is something that, I'll admit, most people don't do this before they've run the experiment itself, or at least a pilot version of the experiment, including myself. I'm not a perfect follower of my 10 rules, but I
10 commandments.
Right. It is exactly. But
you are a sinner.
This is exactly. This is, it is something you can do. You can simulate the experiment and get a sense, like, can you answer the question even in theory, right? And what kinds of effect sizes are you going to get? Oftentimes, you can get an intuition for this, or you have an intuition for this. The models we have in the paper, sort of win, stay, lose, shift, and Riscola-Wagner and choice kernel, you kind of get a sense for how those are going to behave, right? Win, stay, lose, shift. After I lose, I should be switching, and after I win, I should be staying, right? And choice kernel, I should be repeating my previous action. So sometimes this step gets replaced with intuition, right? Like, I know how this is going to look certainly that was the case in this head turning procedure, that we did, this navigation task. I was like, yeah, I kind of know what this is going to look like. I know if we plot on the x-axis the offset and the y-axis the error, I know there's going to be, if there's an averaging, there's going to be some sort of linear relationship between those two things, at least in the region that they're doing that. But if you don't have that intuition about the task and about the model, it can be really useful, and it gives you a sense. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty there because you don't necessarily know what the parameters are, right? But it does give you a sense of the kinds of behaviors that you can get out of a model, and especially if you have a weird model, that can be useful to test.
Yeah, and I guess sometimes you can also have slightly counterintuitive predictions from a model. For me, the interesting thing is that basically my PhD, I did very much a psychology approach, let's say, and now I'm moving over to more of a modeling approach, even though they're not mutually exclusive. And there was a little bit of simulation in my PhD, but what was kind of interesting is that with a little bit of simulation I did do once or twice, I didn't think of that, but yeah, it makes sense once you show me that is what would happen. I just didn't think about it that way.
Right. Yeah, and that's the beauty of modeling, right? Is everything is explicit, and once you've made it all explicit, the model will behave as the model behaves, and you can see that in a simulation.
So to go to the steps that I'm currently, in some sense, a little bit stuck in, parameter recovery.
Yeah.
Which I think one reason I'm quite stuck in it. It's also because I did grant applications. So that's the main reason. Actually, I've just been doing other stuff. Right. But to me, this is one of those steps that I hadn't really thought about before, that I think is super powerful.
Yeah.
So what is parameter recovery? What are parameters, I guess?
Right.
If people are very new to this, maybe we should also define that. But
So parameters are numbers that you put into your model that determine individual differences in behavior. So, learning rate roughly says how quickly do you learn from experience, right? A softmax parameter tells you how random you are in your choices. And often what we want to do when we fit a model is extract those parameters, right? And you'd like to say this person, has a fast learning rate and this person has a slow learning rate. And maybe this group has a fast learning rate and this group has a slow learning rate, right?
For example, a clinical thing or
exactly,
something like that.
These folks with depression have a slow learning rate or a high softmax parameter or whatever it is, right? And maybe that sheds light on the mechanisms of the disease, right? That would be the sort of, perfect story from a kind of computational psychiatry perspective.
In a way, isn't the computational psychiatry thing just you take the standard approach of letting them do a task and then you have the mean differences in behavior, and now we say, well, we have mean differences in parameters?
Right. That's definitely one way of doing it, right? I guess the idea, right, and the promise is, it's like Iowa gambling task again. Sorry to keep coming back to this one task, right? You can see there are all sorts of groups that behave differently in that task, but there are all sorts of ways that you can get that deficit. And the model tries to figure out, well, is it a learning rate? Is it an exploration parameter? Is it a risk aversion? Is it loss aversion? That is, if it is, to the extent to which these cognitive models reflect cognitive processes in the brain, right? To the extent to which you can separate those things, that is potentially adding value, right? If it's a loss aversion thing, that's a different thing potentially than if it's a reinforcement learning thing. Sorry, a learning rate thing. So you would like to be able to do that with your model. You'd like to be able to say, this person has this learning rate parameter or this softmax parameter or this bias. But the question is, can you actually do that, right? Because the way you're getting parameters is you take a model and you fit that model to behavior. You basically tune the parameters until you find the value of the parameters that best fit the behavior of the subject in some sense, right? Well, does that work in the best case scenario where you have simulated data, where you know the parameters? Because if it doesn't work in that situation, you can forget it in any other situation, right? And so that was and I wasn't the first to do this by any means, but it was something that was pretty neglected, I think, in the field, before this paper. Not that people didn't do it. There are definitely examples of people doing it, but I don't think it was routinely done. And what you find when you do it, I mean, this is where you very quickly run up against the limits of your experiment, is sometimes you can't tell a parameter. You put in a learning rate of 0.5 and you get out a learning rate of 0.9, right? Or 0.1, and it's completely random it's not random, but it appears random, the learning rate that you get out. There seems to be no relationship between the input learning rate and the output learning rate. If you don't have that, or if you do have that, where there's no correlation between those two things, you can't say anything about parameters at that point. And then a parameter recovery analysis is trying to do that more systematically. You simulate a range of different parameters, and you ask, can I recover, do I get them back across this range? And, you could even do things like try to quantify, like, how much information do I have, right? The correlation is a simple way to do that. But it allows you to say it puts an error bar in some sense on the parameter that you get out in the best case scenario, right? And obviously there's a proviso to all of this, which is in real life, they're almost certainly not using your model, right? But at least in the best case scenario where they are using your model, the parameters, are meaningful that you get out.
Yeah, I mean, so the parameter recovery thing for me is, again, as I said, like it's a really interesting and cool thing, because in a way, to me, it presents how should I put it? I mean, it's like a minimal quality control of your experiment in a way, right? Where you can say, okay, we have idealized situations. I'm simulating. I mean, in the thing that I'm doing, we have 3-4 parameters that we're trying to estimate. So we say, okay, we let these different parameters just vary. We're basically pretending we have a bunch of random people with all sorts of different behavior types doing this. Can we get it out of this or not? Yeah. And it's not that trivial.
No, that's the thing that's surprising. When you first do it, you're like, oh, I actually can't get this parameter out.
Yeah, and what's, for example, I mean, for me, so I do stuff on losses and gains and risky decision making, and so what's interesting to me is that, I mean, I still have to do the systematic, like reading all the different approaches to doing it, but there's a bunch of different ways that people measure loss aversion and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I've not seen the word parameter recovery in the couple of papers that I've scanned so far. Which doesn't necessarily mean they're bad at estimating the parameters. It's just, it seems like they didn't test it. And there is this one paper by Valasek and Stewart that is, I mean, it's a relatively small paper, I guess, in June, but it's a paper that just says, that's basically a parameter recovery exercise. Right. And says, hey, this like accept reject test that people use? It's not that great.
Yeah.
It doesn't have great recovery. There's a lot of noise around it. I mean, depending on what you do, that might not even be a problem. I think, depending on what your task is, maybe isn't maybe you have a design where that's not that much of a problem. Yeah. But for many designs, that is going to be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's great that papers can get published doing this, right? Because it's a big deal, right? If you can't get a parameter out and you want to say, I mean, it does depend on the question that you're asking. Question somehow sidesteps the parameter, and the parameter is not important for the question, although, how often that happens, I'm not sure.
I mean, the only thing that I could really imagine where it might not matter, or like something that comes to mind, is where maybe you just for whatever. I mean, if it's a fairly obvious question, we expect fairly large differences. So like maybe your parameter recovery isn't great. There's a lot of imprecision around it, but you're pretty sure it's going to be, the difference is going to be large enough that it's. But then again, that sounds also like you already know the answer.
Right. It's big enough. Yeah. Or you only care about differences that are big enough. Yeah. I mean, So it's great that they're doing that, and it is just amazing in how many different tasks and experiments the parameters don't recover. Yeah, and certainly a lot of the prospect theory parameters, it's hard to get those parameters. The curvature, hard to design tasks where you can estimate the curvature.
And you get papers with very different.
Yeah, and
which could also be for good reason, right?
Every
test is the same thing, and different populations and whatever. But in general, you would imagine there to be slightly less of a spread.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, that gets and that gets at a question that is the model. Is there something fundamentally missing from the model? I always remember John White's PhD thesis at Princeton he did temporal discounting experiments, and all he did was like scale the amounts and scale the times by factors of 10 or 100 or 1,000. And, if you have a fixed discount rate, right, a fixed discount factor, that's, your behavior should drastically change between those scalings, right? If I just scale everything up, all the delays by a factor of 10, I ought to scale my behavior in an appropriate way. And he found they largely don't. And, they're sort of, so it was an interesting question as to discount factor, like now a function of, magnitude of delay and everything else, right? So it was a very, or is it just the way we measure discount factor? And he was doing it with these, where you put a bunch of choices in a row and then you sort of pick the difference point out.
Right.
So, but that was a case where, hang on, if you fit the discount factor in these different conditions, you get very different answers depending on the overall scale of the delays and the rewards, right? Which, if it's a single parameter, is not the case, which suggests something's missing from the model, right? His story, I think, partly, and I don't want to, put words in his mouth, but partly it's just demand characteristics of the task that people expect to respond in these tasks somewhere in the middle. And, that implies a certain kind of normalization, or gives you something that looks like normalization when it's just demand characteristics of the task. But yeah, parameter recovery can be, and that I think was in a task where you do have good parameter recovery, but it was, something fundamental about the parameters that weren't lining up. And that's a case of, a good experiment, right? If there's a single discount parameter, it ought to apply across all different scales, right? And if it doesn't, then you have to change the theory in some way.
Yeah, maybe actually, I think I maybe also found like a better motivation for why parameter recovery is such a cool thing. Because I guess, it can just save you huge amounts of time and complicated problems that come from having a bad experiment. That's kind of the obvious consequence of this. But if I think about, how many people I know I've been kind of lucky actually, my things that this wasn't that much of a problem, but the amount of people I know who have a task where the results are just really inconclusive. And, especially if you think about like clinical stuff where it's difficult to get large samples and the categories are really messy and all this kind of stuff. If you now also have a messy parameter, you're just probably not going to find anything. So just knowing that, okay, we have a task that actually gets a precise parameter out of this just substantially increases the chance that your experiment is actually going to show something.
Yes, that's right. And I think that, and it's a pain up front, right, to do all these simulations and to fit the simulated data and to do everything before you've even done an experiment. But boy, can it save you a lot of time. And especially, with clinical populations, like you say, these are hard populations to work with and get access to. And you want to be sure that you're just not wasting everybody's time with a task, that doesn't tell you anything.
With the accept reject task for loss aversion, I think they said, what did they say in the paper? I can't remember what it was, but it doesn't matter about this task in particular. But if I think they said, if loss aversion, if the true value is a lambda of 2, for this task, what you get is roughly between 1.7 and 2.3. Right. Then, if that's the range you can expect for any participant, what is your hope for getting results when you compare patients with like 30 patients with 30 other controls or whatever, right?
Exactly, right? Yeah, if the change goes from 2 to 5, you can do that, but
it's probably not good.
It's probably not that, right? Effect sizes in psychology don't tend to be that big.
So I think I've sufficiently made the point of why I think the thing that I'm struggling with is actually cool. It's just implementing it and doing it properly, blah blah. But 6 is model recovery. I guess it's quite linked to parameter recovery in that sense. But what's that? How does that work?
So this is the other thing you might want to do with a model modeling is you have a bunch of different models and you don't know which one best describes human behavior. And that can be human behavior in general. It can be the behavior of this particular participant. And so you'd like to be able to tell the different models apart. And in the same way you can do parameter recovery by simulating one model with a bunch of different parameters, you can do the same thing, simulate a bunch of different models with different parameters, so this is like hundreds of thousands of simulations. You can fit all of those simulated data, and then you can ask, if I use model A to simulate my data, is it best fit? Is the data from that model best fit by model A, or is it best fit by the other models? And so how much information do I have in the best case scenario when I run this on human data and I find, okay, model A was the best fitting model? Well, is that because everybody uses model A? Or is that because, for whatever reason, model A is biased in my model selection procedure, right? And that can happen for all sorts of reasons, right? A simple reason is just you don't have enough data and model A doesn't have many parameters. And so, when you have some kind of penalty for free parameters in your model comparison, like BIC or even, leave one out, likelihoods, right? If you do your selection with that, if you've only got one trial in the simplest case, right, you're only going to be able to, you'll always pick out the simplest model, right? The one with the fewest parameters. The more trials you have, the more chance you have of picking out a model that has more parameters. But again, this is another one where you do these simulations and, especially as you get to more and more complicated models, telling them apart just gets really, gets harder, even in the best case. Yeah.
What is so in a way, I guess I'm so rooted in experiments, I see a lot of this as a way to just ensure that my experiment is really good and, does what I want it to do. But in a way, of course, you can, it's just as true that you can use this to make sure that the model that you're doing is good. And so I'm just curious, if let's say you have this task and you have 5 models or whatever, right? You have like a null model or something that kind of just doesn't do anything really. And then you have, added complexity of models or something like that. And then you find that like model 4 and 5 always outperform the others, but you can't distinguish them really, even though they are different. So when do you know that that's a problem about your task? And when do you know that actually the models just kind of do the same thing?
Yeah, that's a big question. So there's a question, I guess the question you want to try and get at is, do they do the same thing under all circumstances, right? Or do they just do the same thing on your task because you've not, tested them in a wide enough parameter regime, for example, or, parameters of the task now? And this can be a hard one to tell. There are definitely some cases where you have models that are on your task, like a rotation of each other in parameter space. And we've come across this in one task looking at sequential effects, a perceptual decision-making task looking at perceptual effects, where you can, the outcomes of each trial are win or lose. It's binary outcomes, and it's binary choice as well. And because of that, you can have 2 models that are mathematically equivalent to each other, just rotations. One model is a sort of win, stay, lose, shift type choice kernel. And the other one, so you have a win, stay, so you have a choice kernel for winning and a choice kernel for losing on the last trial, right? So, or you can have a reinforcement learning effect, which has win, stay, lose, shift in one parameter, and a choice kernel, right? And those are actually, in principle, 2 different models. But if you only have binary rewards, those 2 things are just rotations of each, like a 45-degree rotation. And those models, in principle, you cannot tell apart that they're identical on any one subject. Now, there's an interesting thing. If you look at individual differences, and you fit those two parameters, you'll find the win, stay, lose, shift version, those 2 parameters don't correlate with each other across the population, which maybe suggests those are the independent components. So there's other things you can do after the fact. But in this case, it was the experiment, and a different experiment or looking at individual differences, maybe you can tell those models apart. So that's a case where, and sometimes you can see that you make a model, you think it's a different model, and then you think a bit harder about it. You're like, actually, these are mathematically identical. But then there's this, this sort of funky case where there are models that are really quite similar over the parameter regime you care about, but they're not completely different. Now, one example of this is if you do the prospect theory utility curve You can do a fixed curvature for gains and losses, and then a loss aversion parameter which just scales the loss domain. Or you can have separate curvatures for gains and losses, or you can have all three, right? But if you look in a range, I think I did this in my class. If you look in a range, I think minus 100 to plus 100, and your curvature, you do the curvature model versus the loss aversion model for a curvature of 0.5 in the gain domain, so square root utility curve in the gain domain, you can make those two curves look almost identical over that range. And in fact, to the point that you would never be able to tell them apart by an experiment. But if you did a bigger range, because the scale factor on the losses is fixed, right? But versus the curvature changes with the magnitude of the reward, then potentially you could tell them apart in a bigger range. So that would be a case where in your experiment, these are the same model, right? There's no point in making a big deal of distinguishing between, is it curvature or is it a scaling of loss, right? Different curvature for losses versus an overall scaling for losses. And that would be a case where you would have to ask, do I care about that question, right? Do I care about, curvature versus scaling? Or am I okay just saying, fitting one of those models and saying these people have a bigger loss aversion than these people, this group of people? And depending on the question that you want to ask, you may care about that or you may not care about that. So I think, it really does come down to the question that you want to ask, like with everything, right? And with this, it all comes back to what's the science question you want to ask. And in some cases, you can get models where you can't tell them apart. You just don't care about the difference, right? It's not model class A, but it could be models B or C, but they're similar enough that I don't really care.
I think there's a bunch of reasons for why people don't do a lot of this modeling. One thing that maybe we should also mention is that, a lot of this is computationally quite heavy. And, so I'm not surprised at the early prospect theory papers that tried to estimate these parameters and do it, because it was like the early 90s.
Right.
So, some of the stuff that I do on my laptop can take quite a while. And this is a fairly new, pretty good machine.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's one reason. The other reason is we now get to step 7, which is actually collecting data.
Yes.
So everything we've talked about so far, we still haven't collected any data. And, that's a lot of people don't or can't spend that time or don't want to. But we've reached that point now. Well, actual data, what am I going to do with that?
Right. So actually, if you have done all the steps beforehand, the actual data part's easy, right? And this is where more sort of just prosaic things come in, right? If you simulate your data to have the same structure as your actual data, either you put it in CSV tables in the same way as your data, or you load it into, whatever package you're using, Python or MATLAB, in the same form, you can just use all the same functions that you used for parameter fitting for parameter recovery. You just do it with your data. And now you can ask, well, first, which model fits best of the model? If you have a set of models, which model is the best fitting model for each person and for the group as a whole? And then you can ask, for the best fitting model or models, what are the parameter values? And then, you're starting to ask questions, then it's, what questions do you actually care about then? Are you interested in parameter differences between groups? Are you interested in which model fits best, to a particular group or in general? Are you using it for fMRI to, I guess that gets in there later on, right? Are you using it to then extract model-based parameters that you can correlate with some brain signal? But at that point, you've gotten, you've done what you wanted to do, which was fit the model to the data, hopefully figured out a model that fits best, hopefully got some interesting parameter differences. And now you can start thinking about making a story, so long as you can actually validate the model, right? Which is the next step, which is to go back to simulation and simulate behavior with the parameters that you have, to show that with the parameters that you have, you get the same, you get qualitatively the same behavior out. And especially for reinforcement learning models, this can be really instructive, because reinforcement learning models, they kind of yoke themselves to the choices of the participant during the task. And so if they can never go off in some weird direction, because they're always yoked to what the participant does. They're only predicting one step ahead. Whereas when you simulate them, they could end up in some weird and wonderful place and end up not doing the task. And so that's a really useful one. And this comes back to this, earlier point about choice kernels, right, as being good models in some cases, right, or best fitting models in some cases, but they can't do the task. This again is another chance to show that you fit your parameters to the task, you simulate it, and you find it earns, half the reward that people do in the task. That's troubling, right? That suggests you've really missed something. Or, you get it and it doesn't show the same sort of win, stay, lose, shift effects that people see, that people do. Oftentimes that's not the case. This is one where more, whereas parameter recovery and model recovery, I would say, are as likely not to work as they are to work, just from experience. I think model validation, where you sort of fit the model and then plot the fit behavior, sort of simple statistics of the simulated behavior, usually that does a pretty good job.
I mean, one question I had is if you do parameter model recovery properly with sufficient parameter space, your actually observed stuff should pretty much be in there, or I don't know how
well it should do. I guess you could have great parameter recovery on a model that can't do the task. That's the extreme case. So a choice kernel task, right, or a choice kernel model on a reinforcement learning task, that if it's got no way of integrating reward, it can't do the task. But you could have great parameter recovery on simulated data from that model.
No, but what I mean is you collect the actual data and participants, because you're only testing the models that you tested before, or maybe you're adding one, but so basically my point is, if you say here's the winning model and you get the distribution of parameter values from your participants, ideally that distribution would be part of your initial exercise anyway, right?
Yes, right. Exactly.
Or is that often not the case because people are weird?
I guess, so I think I understand your question, right? In that the distribution of fit parameters, say, is very different to what you simulated for parameter recovery. Is that sort of the question?
My question is basically, from what I understand, the validation is you collect the data, you fit the parameters. So now you have, a list of parameters for each parameter and each participant. And now you basically test whether those values, whether they all have good parameter recovery, right?
Right.
Or did I misunderstand you?
So there's that part. Yes, there's definitely that part, right, of validation of.
Yeah, and that part should be ideally.
Yes. So ideally, you've simulated in the right range. And for some parameters like learning rate that are bounded between 0 and 1, there's no problem there. It can be an issue where you just get these really unexpected outlier parameters. And we got this in the explore exploit behavior with these folks who never chose the uncertain option. They, in a particular parameterization of the model, give us really large parameter values. And in fact, in at least one of those papers, in the schizophrenia paper where we found that, we reparameterized the model it's the same model, but just slightly reparameterized, meaning that the values that you get have a better distribution. Yeah, it's like 1 over the value instead of the value itself, right? The difference between temperature and inverse temperature. So occasionally, sometimes you find that you didn't simulate in the right range. Sometimes you find, and this can be an issue, sometimes you find you can recover parameters in one range but not another, and hopefully you're in that range when you simulate or when you fit real data. So that's definitely one, right? But then there's also the simulating the model itself, like with the parameter, simulating the choices of the model, and then putting those choices through, the simple statistics, like what's the mean number of times they choose X versus Y, under some situation, some circumstances. That also should match up with what you get in your actual behavior. And that's a key part of it.
So I guess we've got a couple of minutes and 2 steps left. So right. I guess I didn't think we were actually going to go through all of them, but I guess we can do it briefly. Number 9, latent variable analysis. What is a latent variable?
Yes. So this is one of the things you can do with a model is if it really is the cognitive process that's going on under there, then there are a bunch of variables in your model that get computed. So if it's a reinforcement learning model, you've got a value on every trial for every option, and you've got a prediction error on every trial, right, for the outcome that you see. And those are things that you don't directly observe in the experiment, and potentially after you fit the model, the values that the model has should be close to the values that the person had when they were doing the task. And so now that latent variable becomes something that you can, correlate with the brain, right? You could say, put it into an fMRI analysis and say, which areas of the brain show a signal that changes over time, like this value signal does, or this prediction error signal does. Turns out that's not completely straightforward to do. And there are caveats to all of that, right? But it's certainly something you can do and gives you, again, is a thing that you can use the model for to pull things out, right? One thing we've done in this head turning task is, so you're turning in the dark and then you get a flash of offset visual information, which is a prediction error. You can, because people have make systematic errors in this as well. They're not perfect. Some people some people's path integration, they will underestimate how far they've turned. Some people overestimate. So you can fit that model and you can get a subjective prediction error instead of an objective prediction error, right? What's the prediction error that this subject saw, given that they tend to underestimate where they are, which is different to the actual prediction error, which was the offset of the room. And potentially that gives us a little more power to, for example, look at what's the neural correlates of that prediction error. So that kind of analysis is really what we're talking about with latent.
Yeah, and I guess in kind of cognitive and computational neuroscience, it seems to me in large part that is almost the goal of having these models, right? To be able to get at these things that you can't get directly from behavior and see whether the brain does that thing.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. And then you can ask the question at the level of the brain, right? And that's the hard interpretation of these models and the strong interpretation. And I think something that maybe, again, with prospect theory, I don't think they were thinking about neural implementations when they first did this, right? But you can ask things like that. Is there a utility signal in the brain, right? Lots of people have asked that. Does it have the same curvature? Does it do this? Does it do that, right? And the model gives you a handle on that, in a way that you can get experimentally as well, but, can maybe give you a little bit more sensitivity.
Okay. We've reached, I always call it steps, but it's actually called rules and then you also call it sections at some point in the graph.
I'm sorry, yeah.
But I realized, so we've reached the final rule, not step, which is reporting your results, which sounds like a good idea. Yeah. So what are some, just briefly kind of the main things to pay attention to here? What should I report? What shouldn't I?
Yeah, I think the big thing is to report as much as you can, right? And a lot of this goes into supplementary material like parameter recovery, model recovery.
Supplementary pages 30 to 55.
Yeah, it can be a lot of stuff, right? Sometimes you could do it in a method. It really depends, right? If you're using if it's a new task and a big part of why you're using it is parameter estimation, then maybe it goes in the main text, right? But yeah, just reporting that, model recovery, parameter values and distributions of parameters, right? Not just means and variances. The simulations after the fact, the model validation, and then obviously, sharing the code and the data, right, is a big component, and in a way that can be used, right? In a way that you can just throw in, you should be able to boot it up in, a reasonable programming language, and you should be able to generate the figures that were in the text. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all, sort of standard good science stuff.
Yeah, I get. If you do all of this and then you don't share your code, I don't know.
Right.
Anyway, but yeah, it's funny. One thing that occurred to me whilst we were talking about some of the early rules is that, in a way, what this is, it's kind of a parallel function to the rise of registered reports. Mm-hmm. In a sense where you write your report and you say what you want to do, and then people comment on it and they find some flaws with the design and how you analyze it and all this kind of stuff. And in a way, it seems to me like that a lot of the benefits from computational modeling, not all of them, but a lot of them have a very similar role, and that you kind of get this outside feedback on your task and how well it's going to work and that kind of stuff. And additionally, you can do all this other stuff like latent variables and that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that is a big part. And obviously this paper was written in that context, right, of the open science movement and reproducibility crisis, right? And sort of trying to head off something similar in the computational world, right? Of just, low quality models that, you can't even tell parameters apart in theory.
Yeah. I guess the cool thing is also that, if people, again, like it sounds so trivial and obvious, but like increasing the precision of the task is such a crucial thing. And, if you realize it has bad parameter recovery and then you manage to make a few changes in what values you use, and then suddenly it's much more precise. And then, that's great, especially if it becomes widely adopted.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Suddenly the entire field is just more precise because of a couple of simulations you ran, basically.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say about this? Otherwise, I'll go to the recurring questions.
I think we probably covered everything right in exhaustive detail. I'm sorry for your listeners.
Well, they're here by their own choices. They could have left. So it's their own fault. They have only themselves to blame. And this also isn't the longest episode. So,
well, see if we can. Yeah, how long have we got to go to beat that?
A while.
Oh, wow.
I think the longest I did was. I think it was actually 2.5 hours with Toby Wise very early on, one of my first episodes. Not at all about his main research.
Okay.
But but since then I've tried to not do more than 2 hours because I just want to kill myself in the edit.
Right.
Which is, just once it takes several days to edit it, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
Anyway, so recurring questions. First is, what's a book or paper you think more people should read? Old, new, famous, unknown, whatever you want, just some recommendation.
I think probably two. So one of them I actually just tweeted about the other day after the Nobel Prize, which is David Mackay's information theory book, which is just really superb. I mean, it's not a psychology book at all, but if you really want to understand the sort of Bayesian approach, it's really good. And certainly, I basically did every problem in the first, 10, 15 chapters. And by the end of that, you really understand something about that. And it also has the later chapters like neural networks and a Bayesian, he was sort of arch Bayesian. So that's a beautiful book.
And also for context, I'm pretty sure the last episode I released on Friday with Soledad Gonzalo Coño, I think that was one of 3 books you recommended.
That's brilliant. Yeah, it's a great book. So, if you weren't sold from that podcast, you should be sold.
If I remember correctly.
Right. Okay.
But yeah.
Right. The other one, just one of these crazy books from the early days of cognitive science. This book, Plans and the Structure of Behavior.
Okay, never heard of that.
And it was like one of the founding books of cognitive science. It's Miller and a couple of other folks. And it's just a crazy book. It was written after they went to this Dartmouth conference on computational modeling, back in the mainframe days in 59 or 60 or something like that. And they were just really psyched about this idea of computational modeling of behavior. And they just ran with it. And it's such a beautifully written book, crazy. It's got a chapter on hypnosis, like a legitimate chapter on hypnosis where they, where once you've read all the rest, it fits in with their idea. It's all about how behavior is driven by plans. And, this is in, pre the good old fashioned AI days where everyone thought it was going to be if-then loops, right? To, understand behavior. But I do feel like it's I feel like it's due a comeback, this idea, and certainly in the context of, what's missing in modern AI, right? It really is this sort of system 2 type behavior and the plans and the structure of behavior. And it's just such a crazy book. And you sense the excitement that they have for this idea of computational modeling. They have no idea, clearly they went to some workshop on it. They have no idea how to actually program a computer. I think Simon and Newell, who were actually programming computers, hated it. But it's just such an interesting idea. And, it was very sort of anti-behaviorist in its approach, right? So it was, sort of Chomsky is not a co-author, but definitely a sort of latent factor, right, in this book. And maybe not even that latent. I think he gets mentioned a few times. So that book, I read it after I got tenure, actually. And it was just so fun to read something just so crazy. So I recommend that one.
Okay, good. Oh, maybe we should have mentioned this earlier, but as all the stuff we mentioned, I'll put it in the description.
Okay,
so people then have to look for it. Second question is, what's something you wish you'd learned sooner? This can be from your work life, from your private life. I don't really mind. Just something where you think that's something that, I don't know, would have helped me if I'd learned a little bit sooner, and maybe how you figured it out or what you did about it, or whatever you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think, the thing, I read this question yesterday when you sent it in the email, and I think the big one actually is like the professional thing is control theory. I wish I'd learned control theory a lot earlier.
Like network control theory, or is that just a part of it?
No, literally the sort of branch of engineering control theory. So, I feel like it should be a standard part of education in computational cognitive neuroscience. I'm going to push for classes at Georgia Tech on it in the undergrad program. It's been applied to neural systems, to how you control the eyes, how you stand up, motor movements. Daniel Wolpert's big in this area, right? That, it's not like it's not there, but I do feel like it's been a missing part of my education, and it's such an interesting way to view things. I mean, reinforcement learning gets at it in some, it's all part of it, right? Reinforcement learning you can think of as being highly related to control theory, but it comes at it from a different approach. And I do think this idea, understanding controllers and the brain is a control system, right? I mean, the body is a control system, right? Whether it's temperature or, or anything, or standing up straight or motor control. I do feel like that's something that I kind of missed in my own education that I wished I would have gotten. I mean, that's maybe not sort of kind of career guidance that maybe you're asking for that. I mean, the only other thing I can think of for private life is realizing the ligament benefits of mild weightlifting. Clearly, I'm not a big guy at all, but I had a couple of years ago, I had all these shoulder issues. And, I was like, am I going to have to go get surgery or something? And I started lifting weights and it just went away. It's not, it's probably 96% of what it was, at its peak. So that, benefits of exercise and resistance training, I wish I'd learned that a lot sooner.
So your doctor just went, bro, do you even lift? And then that kind of fixed your problem.
Yeah, well, I went that. Yeah, I didn't even go to the doctor, but I was like, this is kind of hurting all the time. And, I had injured it a few years ago. I mean, you have kids and, you do all sorts of stupid things, And I had injured it and it just never really got better. But then suddenly I started lifting weights and it was instant. It was really, within a week or two, I think just tensing things up, because obviously not building muscle in a couple of weeks, but just tensing everything up, got it back into the right position. So that's a sort of private life thing.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I have it with, I'm lucky in that I'm quite tall, but never had knee problems or anything like that.
Oh,
but since I was very low. Lots of people who are my height or even shorter who have had to deal with that. I never had any problem with that until I kind of started doing less sports. And now I have it. Like when I don't now, the last 10 days, I've barely exercised.
Right.
And I've been moving, and I've moved from one flat to another. So there's been movement involved, but not really the proper exercise. And my knees and legs have not felt great all day today.
It is amazing how, using the joint, right? You would think it would make it more painful, right? Takes the pain away.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, unless it's like a legitimate injury.
There are limits to this, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, final question. So this is basically any advice for people at the kind of PhD or postdoc border.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So,
you can take this however you want. It could just be for PhD students, just for postdocs.
I guess for anyone early career, I would say, I say this to all my students, like, you got to focus on doing quality work, like embrace the craft of the work and do high quality work that you're going to be proud of. Especially if you stay in science, it doesn't, your papers don't go away, and you want to be able to look back on them and think, this was real, what I did, and maybe I only answered a really small question, but, I stand by the work that I did. And, sometimes you can be wrong, and sometimes something you do might not replicate, right? I mean, there's no shame in being wrong, right? But you want to know that with the data that you had and the experiment that you had, you did your best work. So I do think that's a big part of it.
You mean also compared to doing lots of small projects that don't really answer question properly, or are just kind of done hastily, or?
Yeah, I think, doing things hastily, doing things, there's so much pressure to publish, right? Yeah, I guess the one thing I want to say is if you're a postdoc and PhD student, I see you, I've been there, and, I'm not young anymore, but I'm young enough to have been in a job market that was pretty tight and pretty horrible. And it is, I remember I've been told by senior faculty back in the day, oh, postdocs, best time in your life, all of this. And I'm like, it was maybe in the 90s when the career path was if you wanted it, you would go straight into a faculty position after a postdoc. Now it's not. It is a very stressful time if you want to be on that faculty path. And kind of acknowledging that is a thing. Sorry, I kind of went off on one there, but I do think that's
it's interesting
as well. It's, to acknowledge that it is a stressful time of life. Everybody feels like that, and less and less now as faculty age out. But the folks who came up, earlier than that, a lot of them understand it now, but it's different to have lived through it, to have been a postdoc. I mean, is this the end of my academic career, right? So I think understanding that it's not the end of the world if you leave academia, and a lot of people are happier doing that as well. I think that's, I often wonder, maybe I would have been happy doing that, like it's
what could have been.
What could have been, yeah, exactly. And it really is just like, I got a job offer at the right time. I was definitely getting to the point where I was like, well, if I don't get an offer this round, I probably will could go a different route. So,
then former guest Lynn Odell, who then hired you.
Yeah, exactly. So Lynn, I got the job at U of A, and then things kind of came together from there. But I mean, I think it's, to acknowledge that it can be a stressful time. It's the hooter, the whistle again.
Okay, I guess that's the signal that we have to finish. Then right. That's the bell for this episode. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this was really fun.